This conference will now be recorded.
Hello everyone, welcome to the web component session again. Right, so in this class we are going to discuss how to connect from your Visual Studio to Salesforce and how to deploy your components, how to develop your components, web components, and so on. We are also going to discuss about how to push your components to the open source stuff. Whatever the components that you create in Salesforce, right, in Visual Studio, same components you can use it in Salesforce as well as you can use them in the open source as well. That's the beauty of web components, right? So to start with, right, before you start your development, initially you have to download your Java JDK 1.8 or anything higher than JDK 8, right? So first you need to download your Java, and then from the command prompt check the version of your Java version, right? So if the Java version is less than 8, then go for the new one and update your Java version. That's the first step. And the second step is try to set up your environment variables like home, Java home and Java path, right? So first step which you need to do is you need to check what is the version of your Java. To check that, you can pretty much go to Java, to the command prompt, and from here you can type Java version. So you will get to know what is the version of your Java. So currently it is 1.8, which is JDK 8. So if you have anything higher than that, it's okay, you can still use that. Anything less than 1.8 is not recommended to use for Visual Studio, right? So try to update it. And when it comes to the Java home and Java path, so ensure that you have similar kind of settings. I'm just going to environment variables. Right, I have Java home, which is a variable, a user variable, which I have created. Right, so in that, so I place my path, the exact path of my JDK. So this is my JDK path. Ensure that you have similar kind of path. So when I say similar kind of path, ensure that you should have something like JDK 1.8, 1.9, something in that specific folder where you installed your Java, and bring that and copy over here as a Java home. And then go to the path. So ensure that you provide the proper path. So this is my bin folder, right? So if you go to the JDK 1.8231, whatever I have, so within that there is a bin folder. Bin folder should be kept over here in the path section. So these are pretty much simple. Create Java home and path and ensure that these paths are proper and appropriate. Cool. This is about Java stuff, and you need to install Salesforce CLI. Depends on which operating system you are using, choose that specific Salesforce CLI. And then you also need to download Visual Studio. So here you can choose your operating system. If you're using Mac OS, go with it. If you're using Windows, go with it, and you can download from here. Once you download it, install it and follow the steps which is given by the widget, right, and finish it. So that is about Salesforce CLI. This is the first step which you need to complete after your Java setting is done. And then, so your Visual Studio, from here you can download your Visual Studio. This is generally for Windows currently. If you want to move back to Mac, you can choose one of this. So these two things should be in your local system in order to develop your Lightning Web Components. So once you install Visual Studio as well along with Salesforce CLI, so you will get one icon over here on the desktop. You can click on Visual Studio icon. Right, this is your Visual Studio. Right, right. You have Visual Studio, right? So now add some extensions. From here, you should add one of the extension which is mandatory, which is Salesforce extension pack. This one should be installed before you go ahead. It should be installed. I already installed it. And rest according to your requirement, you can use any extensions that you want. You can use Prettier, so which is a code formatter. You can also use beautification, beautify, which is another extension. You can use whatever the extensions which is required, whichever you feel more comfortable to deal with Visual Studio. But this Salesforce extension pack is mandatory to run your SFDC commands from Visual Studio. So you have to install it. So it has a lot of things included behind this Salesforce extension pack. So these are the primary things which you need to do from Visual Studio before you go ahead with your web components. Right. So to create my first Lightning Web Component, so what I will do, I will create a folder on my desktop first. Any location is fine. First thing is I will create one folder. Right, so now I will store all my elements, whatever the development that I'm going to do, that I'm going to store all these things in this folder, LWC SFDC. This is the location where I will be loading all my components, whether I retrieve it, whether I will create more new components, whatever the modifications I do, everything will be sitting in this folder, right? So let me go to my Visual Studio now. So I will open the folder, click on open folder from here to choose the exact folder which you have created, the desired folder which you created. So I'm going to desktop and LWC. This is the place where I'm going to store all my web components now. Cool. So now we got our fresh Visual Studio window opened for the specific folder which is LWC SFDC, right? So from here, type Control Shift P and create project with manifest. You can also create project without manifest, but there is a lot difference between create project with manifest and create project directly. So we'll talk about that. I'm just clicking on SFDC, SFDX, create project with manifest. So on choose whatever the right folder, whatever the thing which is actually required for you currently, which is standard, which I need to go. If I click on standard, it will create some standard structure of LWC stuff or whatever the things which you want to develop it. If you want to go with empty, you can go with empty. If you are developing something related to analytics, just select this. So for us, it should be standard, so that it will create some standard structure folders kind of stuff, so that we can work on those. Enter project name, any project name it can be. And now we are trying to create a project with manifest. Right, so now we got our project with manifest. Right, so if you notice that we got a standard structure created by the command which we have created. So right, this is structure which we got, right, actual folders whatever required to develop our web components, or else any other Aura components or Apex classes, whatever it is. Since I selected standard as the feature, so that I got all this stuff. If you want to create empty folder, you can still create the empty folder as well. So yeah, so the difference between manifest and without manifest is this: if you create a project with manifest, you will get this folder which contains manifest. Underneath it you have package.xml, right? So with the help of package.xml, you can retrieve whatever the components you have already available in Salesforce organization, right? So you might have created a lot of web components, a lot of Aura components, a lot of Apex classes. If you want to retrieve all of them, right, you can retrieve that with the help of package.xml. If you create a regular project, right, create create project command, so what happens, you don't get this manifest stuff, you don't get this package.xml. And for that reason we are going with manage manifest and package.xml stuff, right? So yep, and to go ahead, so we created our initial project, initial setup. So now we need to authorize our Visual Studio with Salesforce, and again Control Shift P, press Control Shift P and go with authorize an org. Click on it and click on login.salesforce.com. So if you want to create aliasing name for your org, you can create it. For me, it is not required for now. I'm just clicking on it. So now I'm trying to authenticate from Visual Studio. So now my Visual Studio is connected to one of the Salesforce organization, which is this David Demo is the organizations which I have. I connected to Salesforce now. So authorization part is done. So going back to our Visual Studio, right? So from here, so whichever you want to create, right? If you want to create Aura components, you can create Aura components from here. If you want to create Apex classes, you can create Apex classes from here. Right, so whichever you want to create, right, in terms of metadata, you can create metadata here itself in the Visual Studio, right? So for us now we are focusing on LWC folder, right? So this is where we are going to create our lightning web components. So click on this, right click on it and create lightning web component. So provide some file name. So ensure that you follow, right, camel case. It should start with small letter, and if you have some other words within that specific file, you need to use caps. If you don't use that, it's okay, but it's good to use that. Web CMP is what I'm creating, so it follows camel case stuff. So yeah. So now we got our first lightning web component, right, within no time, right? So you will not be able to create lightning web components directly from developer console. That feasibility is not there, right? So if you go back to Salesforce, you might have developed a lot of lightning components from the developer console itself, right? Without using any tool, you can straightforward come to the developer console, and from here click on file and new, and here you will see options like lightning component, lightning interface, lightning event, lightning application, and so on. You can create apex classes, anything that you want you can create from here, but you don't have option to create lightning web component. So that feasibility is not at all there with developer console. So slowly Salesforce going to remove this developer console concept from the Salesforce itself. So that's the plan. We never know when they are going to remove that. So we completely need to rely on some of the editors like Visual Studio, Eclipse, so whatever. So whatever is available, you need to rely on them, right? So that's why we actually logged in into the Visual Studio, right? We are able to create a lightning web component, right? If you notice that, right, there are three different files being created over here: .html, .js, and meta file. So .html, the name itself says that this is a markup stuff. Whatever the UI components that you want to create, you need to write those things within this markup. This is UI stuff. And so whatever the logic that you want to write, that logic you have to write within your lightning uh, right web component JavaScript. So here you have to write your logic. So this is the logic part, business logic, right? So another file which you have is this file basically says that where exactly you want to surface your web component. So the web component which you have created is fine, so but where you want to use this specific web component, in which location you want to use it, right? So whether it is communities, whether it is home page, whether it's record page, whether it is, right, so in mobile app. So you have to define that where exactly you want to use it. So for that, what you need to do is, if you want to expose your component to your to your one of the page in lightning experience, right, or your communities. So what you need to do first thing is this is expose, you need to make it as true first. So then this component will be exposed to your Salesforce pages, right? And then so you have to use targets. If I type target, so these are the targets which says that I can use this component within Lightning record page, any app page, or home page. If you want to use it in community, so you can pretty much use this in community, right? So currently I'm not going with community or anything, so I'm just removing it. So it says that where exactly you want to use your lightning component. That's it. So there is no logic part associated here. It's just that where exactly you want to use your lightning component, and also if you want to set some design attributes, so you can, this is the place where you can set your design configuration. We'll talk about that little later, right? So coming back to my .html file. So this HTML file will start with HTML template tag and ends with template tag, just like your Aura component, which starts with Aura component and ends with Aura component, and your Visual Force pages, which starts with Apex page and ends with Apex page, right? So within that only you have to keep all your code, whatever you want to keep it. So yeah, it should be anything that you write in the UI, it should be within the template tags, right? So going back to JS, right? If you notice that, right, so there are few things which are automatically generated for you, so you don't need to write anything hard coded, right? You don't need to remember the syntax and all those things. Your Visual Studio did this job for you, right? So if you notice that, so the name of the class which you have here is web cmp, right? The one which we have created, we created this with camel case, right? So but when it created its class, so it has created this with capital letter, right? W is caps here, and whatever the words followed by, so those are again caps, right? So it follows Pascal case, so where it has to start with capital letter, right? Class name should start with capital letter, and you are extending it with lightning element. Your class is basically extending lightning element. So lightning element is nothing but your standard lightning, what we can call HTML elements, right? So you have a lot of standard HTML elements, right? So say for example, div element, span element, so input element, button elements, there are a lot of standard input elements. So all those things already part of this lightning element. So if you notice that, if I go back to lightning element and click on definition, so I will be going to the exact file from where I am loading my lightning elements. So this is basically extending HTML element. This is basically extending HTML element, right? And we are naming something like lightning element. So that's what the actual things are, followed by HTML element only. So we have all the HTML element stuff. So we are going to use all the HTML element stuff in the lightning element, right? So this class, whatever you are exporting here, lightning element, so this class we are importing it in lightning, right? In the web cmp, here we are importing that. So this is basically a class. Lightning element is a class which is part of LWC module. LWC is a LWC is kind of module in which you have a class which is lightning element. So this lightning element is basically a class. So whatever you try to import into your web components, those things should be already there in somewhere, right? Those things only you can import it. Let's say in the LWC module, right? So LWC is nothing but this engine, whatever you are seeing here, engine TS, right? This is LWC module. So in this LWC module, you have a lot of other stuff as well about this class. So you have something like API, track, right? These are the other things available. So these are the properties available. I can import this API, I can import this track, I can import this wire in my web components. So right, so it should be from LWC because that API is only part of this LWC, right? So I can import that API, import wire, track from LWC module. LWC module is nothing but this engine. So in this engine, you are exporting your API, you are exporting your track, you are exporting your wire. So these things I am going to so use it within my lightning component, right? So from one specific module, we are trying to import the stuff, whatever available over there. Since they are exporting there in those classes in this module, since they are exporting it, we are able to import them. So if we don't export that, we will not be able to import it, right? So going back to our web component, right here you are exporting your class. So if you notice that your web component which you have here, you are exporting it by default, you are exporting it so that I can use this web component so in other classes also, right? So this specific class I can use it in other classes also since I am exporting it. This is a general syntax which you have, right? So anything that you want to use it, you need to import it here, right? So anything, whatever you want to use it, you have to import it in this JavaScript stuff, right? So I don't need this API wire and track now for now. So I'm going to remove these things. Cool. So now, so what I need is I will start development with very basic lightning web component. So I will be uh, using first name and last name, and I'm going to combine the first name and last name just to make you to understand how exactly lightning web component works. So from this code you will understand basic fundamentals of how to use lightning web component. So to start with, right? So uh, first name I will use fn. Right, what is this fn? So you did not see this kind of syntax in visual force pages, you did not see this kind of syntax in lightning components, right? So in lightning aura components, right, if you want to refer a variable or bind a variable, right, you will be using something like this, right? So exclamatory v dot your attribute name. So this is how you used to bind your variables in aura components. So in Apex classes, like in Visual Force pages, you just use exclamatory and your attribute name. So this is how you used to bind your front end with your back end. So this is how you used to bind your front end with back end, right? But when it comes to the web component, you don't need to use this exclamatory mark, and also you don't need to use this v dot or c dot whatever, right? So these things are not applicable. You don't need to use this v dot, you don't need to use this exclamatory mark at all. So you can straightforward use your variable whatever you want to bind with your JavaScript. If fn is a variable private property, this fn I need to have it in my JS. So for example, fn by default I'm giving as David, right? And for sn, so now I have two different variables, private properties, which is fn and sn. These two properties, so we are binding it with your front end. So without using anything like v dot, without using exclamatory mark, all you need to do is you need to open the curly brace and end this curly brace. So open this curly brace and end this curly brace. This is how the expression should be, right? You don't need to use any exclamatory. You should not use anything like v dot or kind of your aura components which you have created. So directly you need to invoke it like this, right? So yeah, so we assign some data, and for the full name, I will also create one more private variable. right? I'll use, so now I want to calculate this fn and sn to convert that into the full name. So you might think that I can use fn plus sn, right? This is how you should be, right? But thing is, you should not use directly like this. So you should use this statement, because this fn is a field or attribute which is part of your javascript of this specific class, right? This is part of this specific class. You need to use this dot. This is nothing but your current component, current class, this dot fn and this dot sn. If you directly use fn and sn, it won't work. So you need to use this dot fn. If you are trying to point out any variables which you have created here, you definitely need to use this operator. This is nothing but your current class components, current class attributes, right? So this is how you create it. Probably I will give some space in between. So now you have your full name. Cool. This full name, I can refer it directly in my JavaScript, not in JavaScript, in the HTML part. So ensure that you don't give any spaces in between when you are trying to embrace it in curly braces. If you take any attributes, right? So you should not give any spaces, so it won't allow it. So when it comes to the aura components, right? If you are binding with your aura attributes, you can give some spaces, you can do some logics on that here itself, right? Those things are there in aura components, but when it comes to this place, so you should strictly follow this stuff. You should not give any spaces at all. So directly, so call it without giving any spaces. It should start with curly braces and end with curly braces. Anything that you are binding from front end to back end, when I say back end to JavaScript, so you need to follow this expression, right? Flower brackets. Even if you are binding with your uh, some of the methods of your JavaScript, let's say, so I have some method, right? So let's say I have some method like add is a method which is available. So if I want to call this add, so I need to use the same kind of expression. So even for the method, right? Anything that you are binding from JavaScript to HTML, you directly need to use it, this curly braces, and end this curly braces. Within that, mention the method name, mention the property name, whatever. So this is how you need to do. So probably I will put some breaks here. So these are our basic web component, which you have the basic attributes, basic things in it. So we'll try to deploy this. So right click on it on the folder which you have created, and deploy source to org is what we need to do. So prior to that, I will go to my org directly. So this is my Salesforce org to which I have connected from Visual Studio. It is still loading. So deploy source to org successfully ran. So it's a simple kind of deployment, right? You don't need to sweat for it. So now how to use my web component, how to call my web component within Salesforce. Yes, we have created the web component. So that's great. So how to use that within Salesforce, right? So what we are doing in order to test our components, right? So until now you might be using developer console, and from here, whichever the Aura components that you create, right? Those Aura components you can put it within your Aura application, right? You can put it within Aura application and directly test it, right? How about our web components? Is it possible for us to include my web component within this Aura application? Right, if you ask me this question, yes, it is possible, right? Just like your Aura components, you can include your web component, whatever you have created, so within Aura application. So in the Aura application, you can include your web components. So you can create a new Aura application if you want, Lightning application. And here, so whatever the component that we have in Salesforce, in Visual Studio, which is this web component, right? Web CMP is what we have. So namespace is same as we have earlier, web CMP. So let's try to preview it. So notice that I am not extending anything here. Extends force SLDS. Reason for that is I am not using any SLDS at all. So in the web component, I am not using any SLDS. So there is no need of using this force SLDS here. So let's try to view our Lightning component, web component. So yeah, this is our first web component. So we provided David and Tima as first name and last name, and finally full name is David Tima. This is what we have created, right? So this is our first web component, right? So what I will do, I will try to inspect this thing which I have created. So can you see this here? You have something like C hyphen web hyphen CMP. But when you look into your Visual Studio, this is not the exact stuff, right? So you have created web and CMP, right? So if you have any capital letters in between, right? So based on that capital letter, it separates that specific, uh, right, component name into multiple pieces, right? If you see here, so web hyphen CMP. So reason for that is it follows the HTML standards, right? So we call this as a custom element, right? So if you remember, so custom element, import, templates, shadow DOM, all these things are part of your web standards, right? So this is called your custom element. This is called your custom element. Whatever the Lightning web component you have created, that is converted into the custom element. So C hyphen web hyphen CMP. If you have caps in between, so it separates that with hyphen, right? When you create any web component, right, you will not be able to place hyphen directly in the web component, right? So when you are trying to create it, right, let's say if I want to rename it with a web hyphen, so this is not a valid practice. This Salesforce won't allow it, because your Salesforce itself adding hyphens in between. So you can use underscore if you want, you can use underscore if you want, but that's not a cool practice. So if you use capital letters in between, it automatically converts that into, right, more readable format, more readable format. So if you go back to Salesforce, right, whatever the caps letter you have, those things are separated with hyphen. So that's the standard best practice of HTML elements, right? So that is how it works. So if you are calling a web component within web component, right, so then you have to use this notation. So if you notice that if I go back to my our application, I'm not using any hyphen here, right? I'm not using any hyphen. So but still it is working. But when you are trying to call a web component from web component, you need to use hyphen, and this cap should be changed to small letter. So then only it will work in your web components. If you try to call a web component within web component, you have to change it. So these are the conditions when you are dealing with web components, right? We'll look into that as well. So this is one way you can surface your component in your right, like in your Salesforce application. You can also include the same component inside one of the pages, since we exposed our component to multiple pages, right? So you can also view your component, whatever you have created. You can also test it or view it from any place that you want to view it. I'm randomly going to one of the leads page, and from here click on gear icon. So maybe I will go to the record page, basically one of the record. So from here click on gear icon and click on edit page, so which in turn opens your app builder. Right, so within app builder, right, so whichever the component you have created, if you come down, so under the custom you will see your component which is web cmp, right? So I am able to surface it over here because we added meta file. In the meta file, if you notice that, so lighting app page, record page, basically we are in record page. So this record page actually bringing this component into one of the interface of my Salesforce, right? So here on the record page I'm able to see that because I included that target thing, and that one brought up this one. So I can drag it and keep it anywhere that I want to keep it, and save it and then activate it. I can view my component any place that I want to view it. Cool. Right, we got our output, whatever we have provided in the right, in the Visual Studio, in the web component stuff, right? We are getting those things, David Thema, whatnot. So before I go ahead with extra coding on top of it, what we have created, so I would like to create one, right? So open source stuff. So since it takes some time, so I would like to start that open source now itself. So for that also, what I will do, I will go to the desktop and create one of the open source folder. So you can use it anywhere that you want, just to ensure that, so whatever we are doing it on in one specific location, I'm keeping everything on desktop. Let me go to my specific folder which I have created just now. So which is open source test. This is what I have. So now to create my open source project, right? So I'm going to command prompt. So I'm trying to point to the folder which I have created exactly. And to create your open source project, right? So you need to use create LWC app. Create LWC app is a tool which we need to use in order to create our open source. So for that, so you need to use npx create LWC app, any name that you want to provide. Now I'm giving my app for now, right? So before you go ahead with this development, try to download your node.js pod. So download your node.js and install it, right? Then you won't get any issues here. So before you go ahead install your node.js. Okay, it takes its own sweet time, so we'll come back to this place later. Right, going back to our Visual Studio code, right? So what we did, we have created the private properties. So fn is a private property, sn is a private property, and full name is private property. Reason being why I'm calling this as a private property, this fn is not available to any other class. Currently we have web cmp is a class, right? So if I have one more lightning web component, right? So within that web component, if I want to use this fn or sn or full name, I will not be able to use it because by default these are private. Fn, sn and full name, these are private properties. I will not be able to use them in other classes. Let's say from parent to child you are trying to communicate, right? So you will not be able to talk to fn or sn or full name because these are private properties. These are part of only for this specific class. They will not be available to any other classes. If I don't declare anything before my variable, that is a private property, right? So if you want to expose a variable to different components, so to the parent component, right, for the communication purpose, so what you need to do, you need to create the public property. So to create the public property, you need to use API. So API, which is part of LWC module, right? In the LWC module, you have something like API, right? So this API, we are importing it, and you need to annotate it with API. So anything, any name is fine here. Some XYZ is what I'm giving. Now this variable is a public property. This is a public property. So anyone can use it. From parent, you can talk to this child, to this variable. So if you are communicating, if you are embedding one component into another component, from parent, you can supply the data to this XYZ. This is a public property, right? This is a public property and this is a private property. You will not be able to talk from parent to child at all because it is private and this is public property. So the name itself says that this specific property is public, anyone can use it. The name itself says that this specific property is private, nobody can use it apart from the own class. So within the own class you can use it, so you will not be able to use it outside your class. So this thing is done. So I'm going back to my open source. From here I will click So default stuff. So it is creating some of the standard structure.
Question.
Uh, yeah, 1 minute, please.
This
Difference between
conference will now
simple
be
setup.
recorded.
So please go on. Yeah. Yeah, please go on, Chandra.
Yeah. Can you please let me know what is the difference between that simple setup yes and no? Like, why did you select yes? And I tried to do it as no. It asked me a bunch of questions, and I was able to answer it. Like, for example, it asked me whether it is NPM or yarn. It asked me whether it is a progressive web or a standard web. If you can throw some light, please.
So you really don't need to worry about those things. It will ask npm on yarn, right? Npm is a different technology, and yarn is another technology. Which technology you want to use it, right? So during if you say yes, right, it will ask you which technology you want to use it, whether it is npm or yarn. Yarn is kind of Facebook's technology, and npm is node.js technology, right? So between those you can choose which technology you would like to use it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that kind of setup. So for now, right, for initial basic stuff, so you can ignore those things. So that is simple, right? So you are choosing your own technology, like whether it is yarn or node technology, no npm or kind of thing. So that's the only difference between these two. Yeah.
So
So
it doesn't matter, right? Whatever I choose, is that correct?
This conference will now be recorded.
yes, this is still progressing. This is in progress. This is trying to create your, right? So local host stuff, open source stuff, it takes its own sweet time. We'll come back to this place later. Cool. So going back to our code, right? So we are discussing about public property and private property. There is no mystery between that. So if you use @API, this particular property is exposed to different classes. If you don't use that, it won't be exposed to the different classes. That's the only thing, right? So, and this public property is unidirectional. This is unidirectional. From parent, you can supply the data from parent to child. If you make some changes to the xyz, it will not reflect back to the parent. So if you remember the bound expressions and unbound expressions in lightning web lightning aura components, right? So if you try to supply the data from parent to child in terms of attributes, right, if you make some changes in the child, it will reflect back to the UI in the parent also. Parent UI also re-renders again because your child attribute got changed. So that is bound expression. If you change something in the child, it will reflect back in the parent because you are using to give the sample example, in your aura components in general, if you want to call any other component, right, you will be using some component name, and then so attribute name, let's say xyz is the attribute name you have, and equal to exclamatory v dot some name you provide. So this is how you have been invoking it. This is how you have been invoking it in lightning aura component. There is another way you are invoking it from parent to child, is this, so which is unbound expression. So if you use bound expression, which is this, so if you make any changes to the xyz in the component cmp, right? So your parent component, let's say this is the parent component. So this is the parent component. This is the parent component. Basically, this template, whatever you see, this is the parent component. So if you make any changes to the xyz in the child component, your parent component also re-renders, right? So that is bound expression. And unbound expression, if you make any changes to the xyz in the child component, right, so your parent will not re-render. So basically, your web component following this strategy, like unbound expression. So it won't reflect back to the parent. This is unidirectional. From parent to child, you can supply the data. From child to parent, it will not be making any changes in terms of re-rendering kind of stuff. Even if you make some changes to the XYZ, it won't reflect back to the parent. So this is read only in terms of web components. So this is what. So this API, whatever you have here, is unidirectional. From parent to child, you can supply it. Even if you make some changes to the XYZ, it will not reflect back to the parent. So here I have only one component, right? So if I want to talk to the child components, right, I will create one more component like child. So probably I will create as parent LWC. I'm treating this web CMP as child. So I will try to use this XYZ. Here so I will call it as public property. Cool, it is still loading. So meanwhile I will go back to this place. So here it is still progressing, right? So switching back to my code, right? So let me add some additional logic to it. So full name, this one I have this dot fn and this dot sn. I would like to write, so convert them to the uppercase stuff, right? So I can use JavaScript functions here to convert it. I'm holding them into brackets. To uppercase is a JavaScript function. I can use it, right? So and then I can supply it. So as a good practice, do not do that here itself. This one still works, right? So this expression, this dot fn, this one, this dot sn, we are concatenating these two elements and then converting this to uppercase, right? So instead of doing like this, right? So the recommended way is use getter method. Get full name. That's got created. I will come back. So get full name. So here, so you can write whatever the logic that you want to write. So additional logic. So here in this line, I'm able to write the code just in one line, and I'm doing some logic here itself, right? So if you use get function, get expression, you can add additional logics, whatever you want to add it. So what if you are dealing with any additional logics, it's good to go with the getter functions, right? So in this getter function, so what I will do so return this dot fn or whatever it is, or else I will create let full name. This full name, I can keep it over here. Okay. So this full name I can call within my right here. same thing, so nothing different. So whatever the expression getter method you have, this one, take it and put it over here. Cool. That's fine. So this is something we are dealing with getter expression. In the getter, you can add your additional logic, whatever you want to add it, any lines of code that you want to write it, you can write it, and then finally use your return statement to get the thing whichever you are looking from full name or whatever the function that you create. So this is a standard JavaScript functions, right? These getter methods are standard JavaScript functions. They are very much compatible with any technology wherever you use your JavaScript stuff. So this is ECMAScript stuff, right? So we are talking about private public properties as well. So in the parent component, this is my parent components. So now if I want to call my web CMP, right, in the parent components, so I need to use C colon web CMP. So this is how, so I need to call. I should not use CMP directly. This is invalid practice. If I use this is invalid practice as far as Salesforce LWC stuff. For the open source, this is valid practice. When it comes to the right, so if you are pushing the things to the Salesforce directly, you have to right separate it into the kebab case. This is called kebab case. You are separating it with hyphen web CMP, and you can also supply the parameters to the public property, which is this. So XYZ is public property. For XYZ, so let me pass some random data. Let's say I have some data here. So this parent data, I'm supplying it to child, which is web CMP. This should be now available in the child component, which is web CMP. So it should get reflect back to the XYZ. In this place, it has to replace it. So that is what we have to do here. So let me go back to my HTML stuff. This is fine. And this is fine. Cool. So let me push all the components, not just one components. So I'm hoping that yeah, this one is done. Meanwhile, I will come back to this. So heading back to this place in the command prompt. So this one is created my app. I need to go to that specific folder which we have created. So my app is a folder which got created. I'm going to that. npm run watch, which I need to run it in order to display the components which I have created in the open source. So LWC services watch is getting started. So now it is listening. npm run watch is basically listening to the local host. So I can go to my local host. Localhost 301. So this is our initial web component, the first web component which is running on localhost. This is basically This is basically the standard web component created by the open source itself. You can add your own web components within the open source stuff, right? So I will get back to this place, right? So heading back to Salesforce, deploy Salesforce to Salesforce source to org successfully ran. So going back to my Salesforce. So here web CMP, right? So instead of web CMP, I will call my parent component, which is this parent LWC. See, if you notice that, so we got the parent data. So this is basically displaying in child component. In child, we have this attribute, which is public property. So from parent, we are able to supply the data to child with the help of public property. Rest, they are private properties. So only property which is public here is this one. @API XYZ is public. For that reason, from the parent element, I'm able to supply the data to the XYZ @API. So for this, we supply the data from parent, right? So again, if I go back to, right, if I go back to this place and inspect it, so it converts your component into kebab case. See here, you have parent LWC is parent, and inside that you have, right, your own component, which is C web CMP as a child component, and you have parent component. It's separated, right? So whatever the word you used, right, right, that is separated, right, based on hyphen. So whatever the caps letters you have, it separates based on the caps letter which you provided there. So that is how it separates. So this concept is not just as same as we have here in the open source, it is something different. So now let me take the same piece of code, so whatever we have created here, so parent LWC and parent LWC, let me take these two pieces and go back to our open source. So to open the open source, I will create a new window. Yeah, and then I'll try to open the location where I kept my open source stuff. Open the folder, whatever we have, and which one we have. These are one open source test is what we have created. Cool. So in this open source, right? So the standard structure, whatever you see, this structure is created by your LWC app. So open source app. So this is basically following the web standards and then created the actual structure which is needed. And under the source, you will see your modules, the actual modules, which is this. So my app and greetings, whatever you have. So as we discussed, right? So index.html is the entry point for your open source. This is the entry point for your open source. From here you will start. So in the index.html, you don't have anything, you have only div elements, so which contains id equal to main. So with the help of this id, so in the index.js, so with the help of that specific id, we are appending this my app. So when I say my app, this is app. This my app is basically appending and creating it, and this div element now contains your app, whatever you have created. So my is a folder and app is again one more folder, right? To separate the folders, we are using hyphens here. But when it comes to the Lightning Web Components with respect to Salesforce, to separate the capital letters and small letters, we are using hyphens. So here the story is different. To separate the folders, you are using hyphens, right? So to keep it very simple, I will try to open Paint. Right, whatever the code that we have created in the web component stuff, right? So with respect to Salesforce, we'll bring the same code and try to display it.
This conference will now be recorded.
Right, so in your open source, basically it follows this structure, which is like initially it starts with index.html. From index.html, right? So it goes to app.html, and in the app.html, so you have your components, whichever you want to keep your modules, right? So you can keep those components. So you can keep over here cmp1.html, whatever cmp2, and so on, right? So it starts with index.html and it goes to app.html, and in the app.html we have our components, right? So now, so whichever the code we have created, right? So here, let me go back, parent LWC. So maybe I will just go with web CMP, this stuff. I can also copy the folder directly and place it. For now, I'm not copying it. Right, under my app, let's create a folder. Folder name is web CMP, and under this folder, I need to create a file again. Web cmp.html, and new file webcmp.js. So notice that XML file, meta XML file is not applicable here in the open source because we are not pushing anything to Salesforce, right? We are trying to check that in the local host, and that's why that meta file is not applicable over here. So all you need to have is webcmp .html and JS. That's it. So your meta stuff is not at all required because you are not pushing these things to Salesforce. Cool. So in HTML, so I will remove this public property for now and going back to webcmp. Cool. So I don't need this. Even if I'm having it, this it doesn't make any difference, and this API also not required because I'm not using any API attributes now. Cool. Now I can call this webcmp in my app.html, right? As we discussed, app.html is the entry point for the modules. For the actual entry point is basically index.html. Within that we are calling app.html, and within that we are calling modules. So here I need to place my actual module. Right here I'm calling greetings instead of this greeting stuff. I need to call, so I'm using my here because my is the folder which contains this web components. So based on folder we are using hyphens here. My web cmp is what we have. So I will remove this speed and all those things. So whatever. And also in the actual index.js, index.html. So if anything is not required, I can remove those things. So for me, I don't need all these things. I also don't need this. So let's head back to our local host. Okay, maybe let me check my front end now. Full name. So this full name, so what is the exact error message? Unexpected token return full name. It should work. It should work. So let me use the different notation. So we call this as a string literal. We are using backtick here. So we call this as a string literal. So this is the best practice instead of using this way, right? Whatever we are using. So this is the best practice of using it. Reason being for that is, right? So let's say I use console.log. leave it line 1, and right, if I want to go back to line 2, just hold on, line 1 and some data. So I cannot separate my lines, right? In the line 1, you do something. In the line 2, you do something. For that, what I need to do, I need to use /n. So if I want to separate my lines, I need to use /n, right? Coming back to this notation, right? This notation backtick, I don't need to use /n to enter into the next line. I just uh, provide, right? So next line, let's say, let ex some example. I'm going Dave backtick. So this backtick still works. So even I separate it with multiple lines, so it still works. But same thing will not work if I give x1. It won't be able to understand it. So because these two are in separate lines. So this one have a lot of other advantages too. So string literal is a good way of using it. So this is how you will be using string literals, right? So I'm actually invoking this dot f1 and this dot sn and then converting them to the uppercase. So this one still works in Salesforce as well. So maybe I will directly return it. I don't need any attributes also. So directly I have my this dot fn and sn and converting that into the two uppercase, and we'll see if we have anything good coming here. Web CMP, what could be the problem here?
This conference will now be recorded.
Yeah, this flower bracket made some difference. I did not close this flower bracket earlier. So there is one way, right? This backtick notation. This is one way of achieving it. If you notice that without using this backtick also, we are able to achieve it. But as a best practice for the string literals, use this backtick. And to call any of your local variables, you can use dollar and this dot your local variable name. This is how you need to use it. So in other ways also you can still achieve it, but this is a good practice of going ahead. So in terms of keeping a lot of other advantages with it, right? Right. So the same code, whichever you have in Salesforce as well as over here, the same code is working here and there, right? So in your local host as well as in Salesforce also. Now, if I go back to my Salesforce, so let me deploy this first, the complete module. So it is still running. So we discussed about private properties, we discussed about public properties. So there is something like wire property, right? So you have API, you have wire, right? So wire property is something, let's say you are trying to get some data from Salesforce, right? If you are trying to get some data from Salesforce, that data should be associated with the wire property, right? Wire property is always deals with data. So to use wire property, you need to use @wire. So we call these things as decorators. Decorators is a common concept of ECMAScript. So this wire is a decorator, and yeah, so you can use this wire to get the data from Salesforce. We'll talk about this concept later. For now, to talk about these decorators, right? So API is one decorator and wire is one decorator. This is for to get the data. So this one always talks about data. There is something one more decorator, which is track. So track is something, right? If you change something in JavaScript, if you change something in the code, right? So that specific element will re-render in the UI. Your UI will get re-rendered. Let's say, so I'm removing this wire for now. Track some data. If some data gets changed within this data, all right? So then your UI, your markup, so your markup will re-render again, will re-render and display the changes whatever you made in the data element. Since you are using @track, right, whatever the changes that you make in the data, that things will get react back to your HTML. So we call this as a reactivity. We call this as a reactivity. If you make some changes in the data, your front end will re-render, right? So that thing you can achieve it with the track. By default, API is also a reactivity variable decorator. It also acts like a reactivity stuff. Even your wire component, right? Your wire decorator also acts like reactivity component. Wire, track, and API, these three things acts like reactivity. If you make any changes in these elements, ABC or data or XYZ, your front end will re-render and display the output, whatever the changes that you made, right? So for now in this release, right? So you don't need to use track for the primitive data types, right? For the primitive data types, you don't need to use anything like track. By default, all the private properties are reactive. By default, from the Spring 20 release, all the private properties are reactive. You don't need to use @track. So you need to use @track only when you are dealing with objects, when you are dealing with the data like records, record 1, record 2, record 3. Out of those records, if you are making some changes to specific fields and you want those things to be reflected back to the front end, then you will be using @track. So for the for the primitive like fn and sn, as long as these are not objects, as long as these are not wrapping of records, so you don't need to use @track. So even if you use track, it still works, but it is not necessary to use track to make it reactivity for the right primitive data types where you don't have anything like right record data, JSON data in terms of records kind of stuff, right? So that is how it works, right? Let me go back to the Salesforce.
Timo, connect your charger, Timo.
Sure, Srikanth, thanks a lot. So you can still see the output is same. We use backtick operators, and we are able to convert that into uppercase.
This conference will now be recorded.
Yep. So this is how you communicate from parent to child, and also we discussed about public property and private property, and we also discussed about wire and track. So So I will talk about more about wire and track in the further sessions, right? So for now, let's keep the thing simple. API is a public property where this can be used in different class also. And if you don't use any decorator before your right property, that means that that is a private property. If you use @wire decorator before some property, you can deal some data. You can get the data from Salesforce servers, right? So if you are using @track to, you can make that specific element as a reactivity element. So that is how it works. So now, so going back to the code, let's improvise our code here, right? For the first name, probably I will use input element, input value equal to, so I should not use this. So I need to use directly whatever the property I want to bind it, right? And on click of it, on click or on change of it, I want to call one of the method in JavaScript, handle change. This is cool. I also need a name, input one or anything is fine. Same thing. I will try to copy it. This send. So handle change is a method of your JavaScript. So here I need to use a method, right? So if you notice that the method which I'm creating here, I don't have anything like component. I don't have anything like helper. I don't have anything right. So right, other things. Only thing which I have here is event. If you are dealing with events, so whereas in other components you have CMP, you have helper, you have event. There are three different attributes. It follows some JSON structure, right? Here there is no such thing. So directly you can use your function name, and event is the attribute which you can have it or you cannot have it, right? So reason being for that, if you want to handle something based on the event stuff, you can keep event here. Otherwise, you can even ignore this event, right? So these completely different when you compare with the right Aura components. In the Aura components, you have some function name, right? Name and function. So you will have some function here. Within function, you have some parameters. That's the crazy stuff which you had earlier. So here the concept is simple. So you can directly use the method name, which is this handle change, and it contains event. So this event, right? From this event, you can get the data, whatever you are changing it in the element, separate elements. Input element is what we have. So I want to get the value of it. I want to get the value of it when I am changing the data on change of it. So for that, so what I can do, event dot target dot name, right? So instead of name, I can directly get value also. So whichever the data I enter right, into this specific area, into this specific element, HTML element, right? So that specific data will be captured in the event dot target dot value. Since we are calling this value attribute, which this is one, we will be getting this fn data, this value data only. If you want to get the name property, if you want to get the name property, you need to use event dot target dot name. Let name event equal to event dot target dot name is what you will be using it. So now, right, so whatever the value that you get within that, right, so what we will do, we'll supply that data to this fn. And yes sir, so I will use one if condition, name equal to, so to compare it, what exactly I have two elements, right? So one input element is this, another input element is this. I have only one method which is handle change, so I need to identify which one I am basically calling it. For that reason I am using, right, so event dot target dot name, which brings that either fn or sn, right? So here I have fn, so I need to use, so triple equal to operator. It's a best practice because it exactly compares the data type which is needed. So you can use double equal to as well, but triple equal to operator acts like equal to operator, right, which really takes care of data type conversion, like it compares the exact data whatever needed. So you need to go with equals to operator whenever possible, triple equals to operator whenever is possible. And else if sn. So now I would like to assign this event dot value, whatever the value that I get, to the local private properties, which is fn and sn. So initially I have David and Timo, that's fine, but I want to assign the dynamic data. So for that reason, so this dot fn. So whenever you are calling your local private property, you need to use this operator. Not only private, any property that you are trying to call it, so you need to use this dot, this dot. So value whatever you are getting it. That's cool. So for the sn, this dot sn. So I think I can directly use this val because I already captured it. So simple function, so which you have handle change, and within that, so event is what you have to capture the event, whatever the event that you are triggering from the front end. So you can get that specific element details. It can be input element, it can be div element, it can be any element. So this event will capture that specific element. So event dot target is something. So out of these two things, right, out of these two elements, right, currently I have two elements here. Out of these two elements, it will tell which element you are currently typing it, which element you are currently using it, whether this one or this one. Target is that. So you might have hundreds of elements in your markup, but event dot target brings you the current element on which you are working on, right? So that is how it works. So input val equal to fn, and this is what I have. Handle change, we are using event, and event dot name and event dot val, so is what we have. So it should be this. So we'll try to deploy it. If everything is fine, we'll be able to deploy it. right? And notice that I am using input elements, right? I'm using input elements instead of using lightning based components, which is very easy to use it, right? We'll get into that as well. So currently I'm not using anything like lightning based components, right? So reason being for that is, yeah, so reason being for that is your lightning based components will only work within Salesforce. Your lightning based components will only work in Salesforce. It will not work in, right, open source stuff. So currently that is not at all there. So that's why we are going with standard HTML elements. We are not using lightning based components. If you use lightning based components, that is very easy to use it, and you can easily achieve the things because Salesforce already provided the base components, which has already everything inbuilt behind the scenes. You can just use those elements and achieve the requirement. But that lightning based components will not work in open source, and that's why we are going with input elements over here. So it seems we are able to deploy it. Right, so the moment I start typing something, that is getting reflected here, the full name. Right, so your event is firing. So whenever I type something, so your event is firing, and that is basically changing this full name. So notice that I did not decorate this full name. I did not decorate this full name with @track, right? This full name, we haven't decorated that with @track, but still your UI is getting changed because your private properties, so your properties by default, they are reactive. You don't need to use @track now for the primitive stuff. Only if you are trying to change the data fields during that time, you have to use @track. We'll talk about that also in the further sessions, right? So that's it for now. So thank you so much, guys. Thanks for joining this session. Have a great day. Bye bye.